Yeah, I would have gotten this to you yesterday, but I figured I'd have a whole day of having this series haunt my thoughts and my dream. Last night was not a good night's sleep. So Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, is another Jeffrey Dahmer story with the weirdest title ever. Dahmer Monster, Dahmer. Why not just call it the Jeffrey? Anyhow. Seems redundant, but it is another telling of the Jeffrey Dahmer story. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, we need another one. But how many times are we going to tell this guy's story? But that's why this is worth watching and worth talking about, because it's not just another, oh, hey, a look into the life and times of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's a Ryan Murphy production. You might know him from American Horror Story and American Crime Story fame. And I bring that up because I feel like this Jeffrey Dahmer story on Netflix is a culmination of the two concepts of American Horror Story and American Crime Story. And that's where the show stands out. In terms of the cast, Evan Peters plays Jeffrey Dahmer. Gonna get it right out of the way right now. He was absolutely incredible as Jeffrey Dahmer in this telling. I've seen people be like, I hope he has counseling and a lot of friends around him, because that must have been taxing on his psyche. When I first read that, it was before I saw this miniseries, and I was like, oh, that's probably exaggeration. Then you watch it and you're like, yeah, okay, I don't disagree. A thing I liked about Evan Peters' portrayal of Jeffrey Dahmer and how this show handled Jeffrey Dahmer is it did bring a believable humanity to the monster. That's not to say empathetic or making excuses for, just in terms of context. You can show context for something or someone horrific without making excuses for them, and I felt that's what the show did well. For people who love their true crime dives, it does have that true crime insight into the life and times and the past of Jeffrey Dahmer. The first episode is tension incarnate. What I liked about the tension was the subtlety of it. From the get-go, you can tell this show knows and recognizes they are dealing with a real story in which there are real lives that were affected and continue to be affected by this monster to this day. So it's not too gratuitous. It doesn't show the dissections as they're happening. In fact, a lot of the times when Dahmer is dissecting bodies or whatnot, you hear it through the walls. It shows the neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, played by Niecy Nash, also incredible. And yeah, if Evan Peters is in the conversation for award time, Niecy Nash has to be too. I've said before, and I maintain, there is a difference between gore and horror. You can have horror without gore and gore without horror. What Jeffrey Dahmer did was horrifying. You don't need to see it on camera as it's going down to know that it happened. It is far more interesting concentrating on his neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, and her hearing the sounds and smelling the horrific smells of decaying bodies in the apartment next door than just, blood. Because Dahmer, and we need blood. It's not to say it doesn't show anything, because if you don't show anything, you don't get a sense of what Dahmer's doing, and it's almost an injustice at that point. There is a fine line. You need to show enough to do the family's justice in terms of the horrors. You don't want to show too much to where it's gratuitous, to where now you're disrespectful. It's a fine line to ride. I felt this series wrote it very well. And I love the subtlety and tension of that first episode. It shows him cleaning off one of those electric chicken saws, cleaning the blood off. You look around, you're like, yep, sulfuric acid. It's like the prop department knew what they had to have in that apartment. I mean, the apartment was actually constructed. I've seen layouts of Dahmer's apartment. I'm like, that's the apartment. But in terms of subtlety, there's this one moment that I caught and I was like, dude, but he goes into his fridge to get a beer and he just opens it and closes it. And at the bottom shelf, you see a head, but it doesn't have that close-up shot while the door is closing of the head. It's just, he gets a beer. And if you notice the head in the bottom shelf, you notice it. And if you don't, you don't. Subtlety like that is masterful, and it makes it so much scarier for people who do notice it. If you don't notice it, the audience doesn't really feel like they lost out on anything. Still a horrifyingly tense situation as it is. You don't need to see the head in the fridge, but damn. Did I mention already that last night was not a good night's sleep for me? Because it wasn't. So that first episode opening up with Glenda Cleveland in her living room, hearing the sounds of Jeffrey Dahmer, I was like, oh, this is a very interesting take for Jeffrey Dahmer and seeing it through the eyes of the people around him. And the trailer showed that too. Then the next few episodes are pretty much the life of Jeffrey Dahmer. I was like, okay, it's a better produced story of Jeffrey Dahmer, but okay, I guess that's what we get. But I can tell you the exact episode that elevated this miniseries to the next level. It's episode 6. It concentrates on a death victim of Jeffrey Dahmer named Tony Hughes. It shows his life. It shows him hanging out with his friends. It actually does a really creative thing when he and his friends are signing and talking all the ambient noise goes down. It was just a really good way of getting into the life of Tony Hughes. This whole episode is about him. So when he runs across Jeffrey Dahmer, it's not, oh, Jeffrey Dahmer and he's about to kill another victim. It was, oh, Tony Hughes has run across Jeffrey Dahmer, and now you're pleading for his life. And from that episode on is when the show largely concentrates on the people around Jeffrey Dahmer, the lives he destroyed. There's a lot of destruction that orbits murder and a lot more victims than those who were murdered. The families around those people, those are victims. The loved ones, the friends, they're victims. I appreciate this miniseries for that. I feel like this show might set a new standard as to how to show serial killer stories after this. I was even interested in how this series showed how the parents dealt with it, because that is a thing I've always thought about, where someone murders somebody or someone's a serial killer and there's a lot of conversation around it. But I would always think, like, how do they deal with that? Granted, it's probably not always in the healthiest way, and the show shows that it's not. There's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame going around, a lot of internalized blame. Because there are things that we're just wired. Our brains are wired to process in a normal, healthy way. That information's not. You know, you have, oh, politician backed out on a promise. Maybe they lied. Bills suck. Oh, there's an unexpected bill. You know, these are annoyances, but they're things that we know how to deal with because, you know, we've lived this long. Your son's a serial killer. He killed up to 17 people and he ate them. It's just, there's no part of your brain, there's no part of a parent's brain that's prepared for that. Look, in the end, this monster Jeffrey Dahmer series on Netflix, I thought it was really well done. It chronicles Jeffrey Dahmer's upbringing and his past in a way that begs to ask why. Like, how did this happen? But it does that in a package that also pays respect to the victims and the families, but also has a very deep and interesting conversation about the systems that failed his victims. It's all part of a deeper and far more interesting conversation surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer than the conversation I've usually heard, which is the serial killer who ate people. In a world where Jeffrey Dahmer stories are a dime a dozen at this point, I feel like this is one that does give you something new, even if you're someone who's seen all the other ones. I feel like this is still worth checking out. I mean, granted, it'll haunt your dreams. I mean that in a good way, though. It doesn't sound very good, but I feel like with subject matter like this, there are one of two possibilities. Either gonna haunt your dreams, or it's gonna be forgettable. And given the choice of the two, I'll take the former over the latter. The one thing I will say is sometimes it time jumps, you know, you're dealing with the present and in the past. It time jumps a couple times to where it was jarring. I was like, wait, what year are we in? All right, so Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever you thought, comment below, let me know. And as always, if you like what you've seen here and you want to see more, click right here to see more.